Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, SignalR, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Caprogman-Taylor, and this is episode 3, CoreWF with Dustin Metzgar. In this episode, I interviewed Dustin about CoreWF, the Windows Workflow Foundation, and a little about the challenges of converting a .NET Framework application over to .NET Standard. Some of you may know him from his recently published book, .NET Core in Action. Dustin is much better at introducing himself than I am, so I'll let him do that during the episode. But before that, let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin.
My name is Dustin Metzgar. I used to work for Microsoft. I was on the .NET Framework team, kind of in and out for about almost 10 years. And when I started, they were just getting ready to ship .NET 4. And before Microsoft, I had worked for a bunch of different companies that actually had been using .NET Framework. I was using Workflow in one of those companies, and then I was really interested. I actually went for an interview with Microsoft and got accepted into the Workflow team. And I was kind of working on performance and actually setup for quite a while, and then moved around, did some Azure services, and actually came back to Workflow and ended up running the Workflow team, at least what was left of it. I had a team of about 10 people, and we were supporting Workflow in the .NET Framework, also system.transactions, which includes that like transaction scope, which was introduced in .NET Framework 2.0. That was ported into .NET Core, and then my team supported that as well. We had made an attempt to port the Workflow Foundation over to .NET Core, but ran into some roadblocks. But while the whole .NET Core thing was going on, before 1.0 came out, I was approached by Manning Press, and they were, Manning Publications, sorry. They wanted to see if I was interested in writing a book on .NET Core. And I thought, wow, that would be great. I'd spend a few months and write a book and check one of those things off of my bucket list. 2 years later, it's finally in print. The name of the book is .NET Core in Action. It's actually a lot thinner than I imagined it was when I was writing it, because it certainly felt a lot bigger, but I'm actually glad with the size. I think it's more approachable. The book is actually part of like a set of 4 books. So Entity Framework Core in Action, ASP.NET Core in Action, and Xamarin in Action all fit together with my book. My book's kind of like the lower level, the foundational part of what is .NET Core, what is .NET Standard, and then EF and ASP.NET and Xamarin are all kind of branching out from there. Although Xamarin was a bit earlier, and I think that book was already being built before mine was being written. So even after Microsoft, I'm still doing some, I basically took the code that we had done for the Workflow Foundation and made my own repo and started trying to convert that over to .NET Standard. And it's presented some really interesting challenges as far as kind of enlightening me to how would somebody convert something that's in the .NET Framework over to .NET Standard, and what kind of things would you run into? And that's something that we can talk about later.
I mean, just looking at some of those points there, there's a lot of stuff. You're mentioning that you worked on the WF team. Mm-hmm. I guess you could be Mr. WF, to coin a phrase. You're attempting to open source it, and, you have all that background knowledge as well, which is incredibly useful, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting what they attempted to do with Workflow. So when I say Workflow, I mean the Windows Workflow Foundation. What they did with it in the .NET Framework was, I think they just had that one vehicle for releasing things, and they kind of crammed everything into it. They didn't have what we called out of band. So like in band would be, you ship with the .NET Framework on their ship train, which is like every year, every 2 years. And that's doesn't give you a lot of chance for iteration, and you got to make sure everything's thoroughly tested and stressed and everything before it goes out. So it kind of creates a lot of pressure for features that go into that. But also it doesn't give you a lot of vehicles to get things out. So later on they had this term called out of band, where you could make like a library that you just released, say through, I think Codeplex was the thing that they called it at the time. But now it's like you have .NET Standard and .NET Core all on GitHub. The releases go onto NuGet. Everything's kind of out of band. There's .NET Core actually has like an actual ship train with point releases, things like that. But you can actually have a library that's not part of the .NET Standard that can ship whenever it wants. And that really wasn't a concept at the time. So what that ended up doing was they didn't have these out-of-band things. They didn't have other ship vehicles. So they decided, like, let's just take everything that we want to ship and then cram it into the .NET framework. And that was things like they had a SQL persistence provider that went with workflow, that you could persist your workflows to a SQL Server database. And that came with, there were actual SQL files in the .NET framework. If you go into the .NET framework directory, there's actual SQL files, and you can run them against your database to set that schema up. There's a part in there where workflow uses expressions, and those expressions can be written in either VB or C#. But when they were doing the VB part, which was what they had initially for .NET 4, there was no external compiler that they could use. So what they ended up doing was basically taking a copy of this VB compiler, embedding it in the .NET framework, and then using that to parse the VB expressions during the startup time for the workflow. And later, when .NET 4.5 came out, they added C# support. But then what they did was they used MS-Build to run the C# compiler against the workflow to parse the expressions. And then it builds the thing into the assembly. So this was all before Roslyn was available. So they had all these kind of tricks mixed in there to make it work. And then there's actually a workflow designer that's a whole WPF app. And they put the whole source code for that into the .NET framework, and then people rehost it. So there's actually companies out there, say like Flowster and UiPath. Actually, there's a product that VMware uses where they rehost the workflow designer from the .NET framework to build workflows inside of a custom application. So it's a super complex chunk of the .NET framework that has all kinds of issues with trying to port to .NET Standard or .NET Core.
So would you mind, for people who don't know what the Workflow Foundation is there a brief overview that you can give?
Sure. The idea I usually explain to people is, let's say you have a console application where it writes something to the console and it waits for your input and then responds to the input that you give. And the classic example is basically that input. There is no guarantee on when that input is going to come, because it's coming from some external source, which is the human that's typing in. So they could start that program and not type anything in ever, or they could wait a whole year or whatever. But basically they're locking up a thread at least, or an entire process, to wait for some input. And the thing with a workflow is basically you're saying, I want to wait for this input, but I can unload that object, that whole thing, that whole process, and persist it, and then wait until the input is available, and then wake it back up and then run it. And that's the really the core idea. And from there, you can put all kinds of things in and basically build long-running applications that need to respond to inputs, at unpredictable times, and might need to set timers and wake up at certain times and do things. But yeah, the real core of it is just this kind of long-running in response to or timers or in response to inputs. Yeah, does that fill it in? Or
Yeah, that makes sense. So you could build something like I guess it's where things like workflows for SharePoint came from.
Yeah. Actually, so SharePoint uses the Windows workflow in a number of ways, and there's different SharePoint workflows. So SharePoint 2010 workflows uses the old workflows from .NET Framework 3.0, and then SharePoint 2013 workflows use the .NET 4 and above workflows. And then there's Flow in SharePoint, which uses the Azure Flow system, which is totally different than the .NET Framework version.
Okay. So I can imagine that perhaps like you were saying, maybe I create maybe not a web app, because that would be a bad idea, but if you created an app that would run on everyone's machines when they log in, for instance, let's say that they needed to supply some credentials to access a network drive or something, and you didn't want to use the Windows internal, like the AD stuff, for some reason, you could then have a WF system, or is it an app?
It's called a workflow.
Oh, so it would just be a workflow. Okay. So you would have a workflow that would sit and would be running, would be waiting for the user to type in some credentials or type in some secret to give them access to something. And like you say, they could do that it could be 5 minutes after they've gotten in. It could be as soon as they turn the machine on. It could be, I turn the machine on, I log in, I don't lock my computer for some strange reason. I walk away, make a cup of tea, cup of coffee, get talking to Jeff about something, go to a stand-up meeting, come back, unlock, and then, yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
Right.
Because you don't want the processor to be sitting there just burning through a process or a thread and wasting time and wasting memory.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So it's kind of like async programming, I guess, in that aspect.
Yeah, it is, and it has a weird relationship with async, because it's this is kind of before the whole the TPL came out, the whole async await and task parallel library and that kind of thing. So it's actually, if you're looking at the code for it, it's using this ancient thing, which is the iasync result, which is begin end programming, and it's a terrible way to do async. It's so confusing.
So obviously you're attempting to create an open source version of this in the form of CoreWF.
Right.
I'll put a link in the show notes. So I guess essentially it is an open source implementation, or is it an open source version of, here is the code that runs it, I'm just literally taking that and open sourcing it?
We pretty much established, like, we're not going to be able to, there was no desire, and there's actually a lot of technical challenges to convert the workflow foundation into .NET Core or .NET Standard within Microsoft. And that's usually just based on how many customers are using it. So that's a decision I can totally understand. I mean, it's a big investment from Microsoft's standpoint to do that conversion. But it's not as nearly as high volume as, say, something like ASP.NET. But for the customers that do use workflow, it's a big deal, because it's a critical part of their app, or it's doing something that's really a key piece of their business. And I'm hoping that I come up with a version of this that's good enough that people could actually kind of convert over to .NET Core and .NET Standard, and then run on Linux, but we'll see. So, but basically, I'm taking the code from what we had in the .NET framework and trying to convert it to run on the .NET Standard.
So you're talking about there's a lot of technical limitations. Is this literally because there are maybe APIs that are exposed in .NET framework which aren't in .NET Standard yet, or is it that there's just a lot of difficulty in converting something that, like you say, is using the old way of doing async stuff over to using, async await? Actually,
so that's what's surprising, is that that's not actually a problem anymore. So, like, before .NET Standard 2.0, it was a big problem. There was all kinds of, like, system.component model things. There was just a lot of pieces that we had to work around to get it to work. And we did manage to get it to work on .NET Standard 1.3 without XAML. And I can go into that. But now with .NET Standard 2.0, it's almost the exact same source code. But the technical challenges come around, say, with when workflow persists, it uses a serializer called the Net Data Contract Serializer. And for people that have used WCF or workflow might be familiar with this, but basically there's a thing called the data contract serializer, and then you mark your classes with data contract, and you include things in the data contract by marking your properties with data member and things like that. And that allows you to serialize your objects into XML. The net data contract serializer it builds on that, but it adds type information into the XML so that when you're reading it, it knows where those types are. Because if, say, like it says, like, if you're serializing a shape, this will actually, like the net data contract serializer will say, the element name is shape, but plus the type is this assembly, this type specifically, and then so that the thing that's reading it can pull it back in. So net data contract serializer is not included in the .NET standard, and it's not going to be converted. The data contract serializer is there, but it's not good enough for what workflow does. It needs that net data contract serializer because it needs that type information. I'm kind of going through another thing where there's a binary serializer now in .NET standard, but binary serializer works differently, where it's an opt-out model versus data contract serializer is an opt-in. So basically, I have to go through all of the types and kind of reverse the properties, because binary serializer is going after the fields, and I have to say, don't serialize this, and as opposed to being inclusive on the other side. So that's one of the challenges. The other one is XAML. So there is not a .NET standard version of system.xaml, and there's lots of reasons for that, and they all make sense. So because there's an implementation of XAML in Mono, there's one in the .NET Framework, there's one in UWP, and they're all different. And making one version of system.xaml in .NET Standard, it just wouldn't work. The implementations are all different. So they started coming up with something called the XAML standard, which has like kind of the core pieces of XAML that should be implemented the same across all of them, but it's not an all-inclusive thing. And it's also not a tangible thing, really. It's more like a document that says, this is the XAML standard. So you don't have system.xaml, and then workflow used it heavily because all the workflow definitions are done in XAML. And I found something where there's something called portable.xaml. It's a library out there on GitHub and NuGet. And it's like a port of the Xamarin version of XAML over to .NET Standard. And I'm taking that and trying to fit it into WF and trying to get it to work, it's going pretty well actually so far. So there might be some fixes that we have to do there. But
so you'd mentioned that Microsoft, I guess, had tried to create a XAML standard, but because each of the different platforms had implemented their own version, it's similar, I guess, to the base class libraries and why we have the .NET standard, I guess, except that it would be more difficult to implement because each version of a platform, so like you said, Mono has its own XAML and .NET Framework has its own XAML, and I guess, if and when .NET Core gets a XAML, it will be maybe even slightly different still because of the different platforms.
So in the .NET standard, right, so they don't want to put XAML in there starting with .NET Core. So .NET Core is an implementation of the .NET standard plus whatever they have in the .NET Core. Just like .NET Framework, you could say is an implementation of .NET standard, although it's retroactively, like the .NET standard was applied to .NET Framework. But that's a weird can of worms. But and the same thing with Mono, where it implements a version of the .NET standard. So it's like the .NET Core, there's no reason to have XAML in it because it doesn't have a cross-platform UI, and you're primarily going after ASP.NET for .NET Core. So like Xamarin would be the real cross-platform XAML system, and on Windows they still want to keep the UWP, the Universal Windows Platform, I guess, as where you're writing XAML apps on Windows. So they didn't want to put like system.xaml, that whole package into .NET Core. they're definitely not going to put it in the .NET Standard because if you have put it in the .NET Standard and you have .NET Core wants to implement the latest .NET Standard all the time. So, it's if you put XAML in there, then it's like basically you're putting XAML in .NET Core too. So it's not not something that they want to do. And also the XAML standard is basically to kind of look at all the things, all the different implementations of XAML and try to come up with the core of it that's the same on all of them, and then kind of use that to drive forward, new versions. We expand the XAML standard, and then we get Mono to do that, and the UWP part to do that. But what's interesting is also the .NET Framework is actually on its last release. There will not be another one after 4.8. There will be, new versions of .NET Standard, new version of XAML Standard, but the .NET Framework is not going to change. There won't be any new versions to implement those standards.
Is that because it's effectively feature complete at this point?
Yeah, we like to use the term at Microsoft it's done. It's not dead. So
I like that.
For people still using .NET Framework, there's still plenty of people at Microsoft that support it. All the new development goes into .NET Core, .NET Standard kind of things, but there's still support going on. There's still, and that support because .NET Framework ships with Windows. Every time Windows ships, it's renewing that support, that timeline. So there's no end in sight for that support.
Oh, that's good to know. That's good for me to take them to the technical directors at work and say, don't worry, we don't have to do everything in .NET Core. It's not like it's going away. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a long-term thing. I feel like I can understand the outside opinion too, because there's say something like link to SQL. If you adopted it when it came in, and you put your app in it, and then you think it's really awesome, and then they come along with Entity Framework, and then all of a sudden link to SQL is kind of sunset. It's still there, but it's not going to get new features, and then if there's a security fix that it needs, and it's it might not get it, and it does kind of feel like you're being orphaned out there. So the only difference with the whole .NET Framework is that it is part of Windows, and that it's Windows is using it, and it's being used under the covers by UWP, and so there's still things, Microsoft things that are running on it. So it should have better support in the future than most products that are done by Microsoft, but
well, let's hope so. Is there a difference between a workflow and, say, something that is a serverless function? So if I have a serverless function that has long polling or something, I know it's a completely different technology stack, but if I had a serverless function with SignalR with long polling, which would cost me a lot of money to run, but if I had that and I had a workflow, is there a huge difference other than the underlying technology? It's not using HTTP calls, it's, that kind of thing.
Yeah, workflow is a bit old. It uses WCF for communication, and it doesn't have this ability to open up like a REST endpoint. There's implementations of workflow, like in servers. Say like there's a server called Workflow Manager that does have a REST endpoint, and it's a kind of an event-based system. You just send it messages, and then the workflows will actually apply filters on like topics. So the messages go into the topic. You put a filter on it, and then if it matches the filter, it will get delivered to the workflow. But for specifically for your question, there's let's say you were totally okay with using WCF one side and SignalR on the other, because I mean the performance difference is it's not even close. But the workflow would be holding a state, and when you talk to it each time, it's moving along the progress of that workflow. So you could totally have a SignalR service up and then receive signals on it and send them to workflows underneath. Because workflows, basically, it can open an endpoint and listen to it, but it's more valuable when it's progressing along some state and handling the incoming messages that way. So yeah, it's just basically, it's not locking a thread or anything like that. It's kind of load up when you need it, do some work, get to a persist point, and then unload.
Is there a lot of overhead from an end user's point of view, maybe not an end user, but from a developer's point of view? So as a developer who wants to use WF or CoreWF, is there a lot of overhead from my point of view in persisting that state, as it were? So my app reaches a point where I need to contact the user for some information, or I need to contact some other service for some information, and I decide that I want to, halt or persist the state for now and await the response. Is there a lot of overhead, or is it just a case of, call an API function and it will just persist and wait?
In that kind of case, it's you would put something into your workflow. So basically, it's designed. You can design it either with code, or you can do it graphically with a designer, where you kind of drag and drop boxes onto it. And then you would put this activity on there, this little box in the workflow that says receive message or something along those lines. So basically that activity is waiting for some input. And then the activity is saying, while I'm waiting, the workflow can go idle and it can persist. So the workflow runtime sees that it's idle and it can persist, and it persists it for you. And then when it gets other input, it says, okay, this input is intended for this workflow instance, and I'm going to go load that back up and then send it the input. So the whole persistence part is kind of dealt with automatically. You have to set up where the persistence goes, like it has to go to SQL Server, or it goes to a file or something like that. But once it's set up, it's handling that persistence and loading and matching to the right instance, starting new instances, completing them, that kind of thing. But from a developer standpoint, that's where it gets interesting. So it's like you could write the workflow as a developer, but it's almost not the target user. Really, the target user is kind of like a business analyst that wants to see the way that the system runs in a graphical manner and be able to modify it themselves. So it's not totally like you could have a BA write the workflow and do it totally by themselves and just take it. That never works. And ask me how I know. But there's but yeah, you could take a workflow from a BA and then have a dev go over it and put it into like a format that makes sense as a program. And I've seen companies do this. Actually, there's a company called EBSCO. They're down in, I think it's Alabama. Their BAs and their devs work together and they communicate via the workflow. So instead of the BA writing a big document with the drawings and Visio diagrams and things like that, they work on the same workflow. And then when they try to show it to the business, they literally just pick up the workflow and show it to them. And then it's very visual. It makes it very clear of like, this is what each of these boxes are doing, and this is how they're connected, how the decisions work. And I think that was like kind of the target for the whole system. And usually it's those designer experiences that you can communicate with non-developers that made it there was a real value add of the whole thing.
It's a little like what UML originally promised, except that someone can create a pattern. Yeah, so someone could create a workflow with these UML-like blocks, and then push a button and actually have the computer run through the process. And then someone can, like you or me, can come along and maybe tweak it to make it like you say, make it make sense or make it a little bit more optimized, or because we would have that domain knowledge, we could go, actually, you don't want to have this kind of control. You want this kind of control because it does exactly the same thing, but it's better somehow, or, it has a better weight policy or a better persistence or something like that.
Right. And actually, and if you're using, like if you're writing a SharePoint add-in, you can put workflows in it. It uses a Windows workflow in it. They have their own designer on the SharePoint side, but you can also make an add-in in Visual Studio and use the regular workflow designer. And basically that's just allowing, you can, if you're an independent software vendor writing an add-in, you can make a workflow. Or if you're just a regular person that runs SharePoint, you can write your own workflow in the SharePoint designer and upload it to your SharePoint site, which is, it's powerful, but also kind of scary in the sense that, like, just anybody can write a workflow. And the biggest job of my team before, like when I was working at Microsoft, was like basically we had an Azure service running workflow for SharePoint Online, and we would see all kinds of creative ways of breaking the workflows. So, I mean, people are impressively good at finding these things. So
I'm reminded of that old XKCD comic where Cue Ball is asking someone, so how did you download this video from YouTube? Oh, well, I copied the link into Word, went File, Save As, and then changed the file format, the file extension to MP4, and it just plays.
That one's pretty good. Specifically for your listeners, I mean, there's the whole .NET standard conversion that I've been going through, and I mean, it's probably the more interesting part of this whole thing is what it's like to convert something as complex as this over to .NET standard. So there's definitely interesting pieces. So like workflows do allow transactions, and I worked on the system.transactions team, and we ported that thing over to .NET Core. But the problem was we didn't port it didn't make it into the .NET standard. It's part of Core, but it's not part of standard, and it's not its own library. So you can't just go and pull a NuGet package for system.transactions, which was really unfortunate because, like, I want to use system.transactions, but I'm not writing a .NET Core app. I'm writing a .NET Standard library. So what I had to do basically was just copy the system.transactions code, put it into my implementation for workflow. I don't like doing that, but that's that transactions code hasn't in the .NET framework, it hasn't changed for a very long time, so I'm pretty sure I'm not going to have to do much patching. So yeah, that one was pretty interesting. There's this whole section about within workflows. So I've got the XAML part kind of working with portable.xaml, and there's a big missing piece there where workflows can have expressions in them. So say like you could have an if activity, and in you could have an expression that basically evaluates it true or false, and you can write whatever you want in there. Some VB or C# expression. I don't have that ability right now to parse those expressions, and the obvious choice is to go for Roslyn. It was never done with the workflow part because we already had other things, and also the way that it was built, it was like part of the build system was to run MS Build, and then there was a custom MS Build target that would go and look at the workflow and pick out all these expressions and compile them and create a assembly out of it. So I don't have that whole thing put together. What I'd rather do is use Roslyn as part of the runtime, so that when you actually load the workflow, it's going to parse the expressions right there. And the same thing for VB. And then, if you could even use an F# expression if you want, I suppose. But actually, I don't know if Roslyn does F# or not, but
I suppose we'll find out soon enough.
Roslyn, they don't call it Roslyn anymore. I think they call it, I forget what the new name of it is, but it should be supporting the .NET standard. And some other things that were interesting was like, One thing that I had to change was the way that events were emitted. In the .NET framework, there's all this old code for emitting events to this ETW system, which is ETW is event tracing for Windows, and that obviously has it's geared to Windows. There was a replacement, like a kind of an abstraction layer that was built over ETW called Event Source. That was in the 4.5 timeframe, or a little bit later, probably. And none of that was rewritten back in in the .NET framework part for .NET. And the WCF team, when they're porting to .NET Standard, .NET Core as well, they had the same problem. Basically, an event source is you could take your ETW code and convert it all over. But what was weird about it was like they use these ID numbers for each event. So each event has keywords, it has a task, has an opcode, it has a unique ID number, and that ID, the WCF and workflow were combined together, and they were using really high numbers like 60,000, 30,000, things like that, which is totally fine. But what happens in the implementation of Event Source, they allocate an array for the largest number, the ID number. So if you have a number ID that's 60,000, you will all of a sudden get an array that has 60,000 elements in it. And then when it tries to compile the system and build the event source, it's actually going through and comparing each event with every other event to check for duplicates. So if you've got 60,000 elements and they're, most of them are empty, this thing just takes forever. And it's like basically I had to redo all the IDs, and that would break any, somebody had stuff that was depending on it, like those ID numbers, and all kinds of things kind of changed with that. So it's like moving to event sources. It's much cleaner code, but it also loses a bunch of stuff that was there before. If people were using it, it's they might not be happy about it. But.
So if I wanted to use CoreWF and create a workflow, because we were porting it to .NET Standard, how would I go about doing that? Do I need to, is CoreWF a port of the WF runtime, or do I need a runtime as well?
Workflow, basically the WF comes with this thing, like there's workflow application. There's a couple of different runtimes. Basically there's a kind of like one that just does, it's kind of like a one and done, run a workflow and just to test it out kind of thing. And then there's like the workflow application is a runtime that you can run in a console app that can host any number of workflows. So it was like they made this kind of base part, and then you could have implementations of that. So another implementation that was in .NET Framework was a WCF service, so that you could have a workflow hosted in IIS, and then when a request came in, it would load the workflow and the definition and run the instance, that kind of thing. So that stuff's not available because WCF server side is not available on .NET Core or .NET Standard. It's basically down to just a console app, and you can use the workflow application that way. So, which is not too bad. I mean, you can make a Docker container and throw a workflow application on it, and then send it signals and run workflows through there. Right now, the package that's on NuGet is only supporting workflows that are written in code. I have a great big PR for adding the XAML support, but it's not all the tests are passing right now, so I'm trying to go through and figure out what's where all the gaps are, that kind of thing. Yeah, so it's the functionality of WF is like the core runtime part is there, but it's like there's lots of features that are missing still, and I'm still building it up and going through the conversion.
If developers wanted to try it out, they can go get CoreWF from GitHub. I'll put a link in the show notes, and then they can build a WF app to run on top of a console app for now.
Right.
But there is a an update coming where they can build a a workflow in Xamarin.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a XAML workflow, so they could try out, like, they have an existing XAML workflow and try to run it on there. So expressions don't work, so that's one thing that will, a lot of people use expressions, so that's the next big thing after that. So,
well, I mean, it's an early release. You can't expect everything to be in there.
Oh yeah. Hopefully, people will try it out and contribute and move it along a little bit faster. I mean, I just work on it on my spare time. So
if folks want to, if the listeners want to go and learn more about CoreWF and perhaps contribute to the source, they need to head over to the GitHub page. Do they need to know a lot about how workflow works, or are there parts of the system that folks can be contributing towards that don't exactly rely on workflow, or are there any resources that folks can go to learn about how it all works, so that then they can come in and go, oh yeah, I can make this change here, or I can make that change there?
If you're not familiar with workflow, actually, you could look up, just Google Bing Windows Workflow Foundation. There's like a kind of a landing page we have for that, and then there's like a developer's guide to workflow, and that would walk you through all this, how it works and how to create one. And there's also a whole section of, like, we have a lot of tests in this GitHub repo. So there's a part of it that has a bunch of like sample applications, like a hello world and that kind of thing. So you could actually go through and see how it's done, how you write a workflow and how you run it, that kind of thing. And the README for the GitHub repo has a full description of all the things that are missing and that I really need help with.
What we need to do is we need to send every single person who listens to this episode to the GitHub page, so that then they can all contribute something.
Yeah, I mean, if they're interested in workflow, I mean, for people that are not interested in workflow and just interested in the .NET Standard, it might be interesting to look at how the project was constructed. You could try to compare it against reference source, because I don't know if you're, but basically reference source, is it referencesource.microsoft.com, I guess is the address. Basically, that's all the .NET Framework source code, and that's kept pretty up to date. Yeah, you could actually try to compare the two if you're really bored, but I try to put into the commit messages when what I'm changing and that kind of thing. But yeah, for people that are trying to take like a big project like this and convert it from .NET Framework to .NET Core, I think the best advice comes from there's like a Microsoft page that tells you how to do this conversion. There's no tool. You can't go in Visual Studio and retarget your .NET Framework project over to .NET Core or .NET Standard. It's basically, you should start with the .NET Portability Analyzer. It's an extension in Visual Studio. You would pick in, you'd say, I want to see what's the difference, say, between my app on Framework and my app on .NET Standard 2.0. And then it will show you the problems, and it will actually have suggestions. Things like if you're writing to the Windows event log, it will say, no, you can't do this. You got to use event source. Or if you're using like the really old, I think it's, web request or something like that, it'll say you can use this instead. Or so there's a bunch of things that it will actually have really good suggestions about what you can do to replace that code with something that's equivalent, but it would actually run in .NET Standard or .NET Core. And then you could take that code and copy it somewhere and take the CS proj and open it up, and basically just it's like literally you go in there and you delete everything.
I do love that about the new CS proj format. It's so much simpler.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I think the easiest way for me was I just go into a console and I say .NET new some class library, and I get that example, project file, and I take that and I just paste it into my new project, the project that I'm trying to convert, and then work with it piecemeal and try to fix things and all that stuff. Because that basic format. It includes all the CS files, and it's just awesome. What I found too with a lot of Microsoft projects internally is that they will leave source files in the directory, but remove them from the project. So it's still in source control. It's still in the folder, but it's not part of the project anymore. But there's no way you could tell, you could try to look through the CS proj and then try to see if that file is missing, but you wouldn't know unless it actually tries to compile it and it says this file's broken or whatever. But basically, you could find all this dead code that was in there. So that's I think it's a healthy way to, you include all that stuff and you figure out, there's a whole bunch of files in here that I left in here that I excluded from the project, but never really removed from source control. And besides that, there's other things like if you had special MS Build steps, and that some of those come with certain NuGet packages, those you have to kind of redo and see if they're still valid. Like things like style cop, it adds things to the CS proj as far as MS Build targets, and that's not going to work anymore. So they've redone it, I think, for .NET Standard, so you can actually still use that style cop NuGet package, but it just works differently.
If listeners want to learn more about you or connect with you or perhaps contribute towards CoreWF, what's the best place for them to go to get all of this information?
Yeah, I would go to the GitHub repo for CoreWF, and then usually so that's under my user, so it's github.com/dmetzgar. I have some other repos in there, like the one for the book, but I actually have a repo for my blog in there too, and there's a little link in there. The blog is actually, it's called mode19.net, mostly because mode 13H was taken. There was originally I wanted to call it mode 13H because that was the thing that I used growing up. It's 320 by 200 pixels with 256 colors per pixel.
I was going to ask.
But yeah, so mode 13H is because it's mode 13 in hex is the same as mode 19, so you could still call it mode 19. And
that's cool. I like that.
But yeah, so that's basically my blog, and then I have actually the source for it is actually checked into GitHub, and you can actually see that, and that's done with Hugo, and it's all in Markdown and that kind of thing.
Okay, so the best way for folks to get in contact with you would be to go to your GitHub profile, I guess, and I'll leave a link in the show notes, and then they can sort of splinter off from there to find a way of getting a message to you, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can yell at me for workflow things, or we're taking too much of Jamie's time on his .NET Core podcast to talk about workflow, which it's just
there's no such thing as too much time. That's not a problem. It's been fantastic chatting with you today, definitely, and thank you ever so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my pleasure. I hope it's useful to the listeners. Really, it's
yeah. Well, I mean, even just taking like you were saying, a pre-existing .NET framework application and porting it to standard. I feel like there's going to be a lot of people who do that. Now that version 2 of .NET Core is out, there's going to be a lot of people trying to create class libraries that are truly portable. They're going to be creating the portable class libraries as opposed to the .NET framework class libraries. And I think it's some good information and advice for the listeners to know, and places where they can go to get for information on these things, because the next iteration of a bunch of .NET framework apps may move over to using .NET Core, like you say, since .NET framework is done and .NET Core is going to be the new hotness. We as developers are going to need to have code that works in both places, rather than, I'll make a copy or a branch and this will be the .NET Core version.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, knowing that at least someone else has done that is...
And so there's other things too. For a friend of mine was going through doing a conversion of an existing application, trying to get to the .NET Standard, and was looking through the dependencies of their class library, and they were actually using the old Windows Azure caching. So this was before Redis. They had this old caching library for Windows Azure. So she found out that you can use non-.NET Standard DLLs. You can take references on them, but what happens is like there's no compile time checking to make sure that those things are actually going to work. So basically, if you're you can do it. Like you can take a reference on a package that's not been targeted for the .NET Standard, but the only way to tell if it's going to work is to like test it really thoroughly, because it's only going to break at runtime. So it's an option, but it's a scary one. So
is that the N1701 message? I believe something like that. There is a like you said, there's a specific compiler error, not a compiler error, sorry, compiler warning that essentially says we don't know whether this package works with .NET Standard or not. Mm-hmm. You're on your own, essentially.
It must be. I think you're more familiar with the codes than I am, but it will tell you like this is at your own risk. But it doesn't say it in those words, but it really should. It should have like a big warning thing that says if you shoot your foot off, that's your fault. So it's
perhaps it should be like a skippable error or something, mm-hmm. so that it actually grabs the developer's attention. Hey, this is something that you need to be aware of, mm-hmm. sort of thing. Because it's easy to miss warnings. When you're the first running through the first time, it's easy to miss the warnings because you're surrounded by errors, mm-hmm. or at least I am, anyway.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
Fantastic. I think we'll probably end it there if that's okay, Dustin.
Great.
Absolutely fantastic talking to you. Definitely.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the invite, and hope you can cut something out of here that would be useful. So.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Thank you ever so much, and thank you so much for being the first person to be interviewed as well. That was my interview with Dustin Metzgar. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a collection of text snippets from the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or a review in your podcatcher of choice, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.